There is a folder on a desk in Bethesda, Maryland. It is gray. The label on the front says nothing interesting. Inside that folder are 6 consent forms, 6 signatures, 6 names. 5 of those names belong to people who are no longer alive. The 6th belongs to a man who lost his fingers and his toes before his 30th birthday. I am Blackwell, and tonight I am going to read you those 6 names out loud. You think you understand medicine. You think when a doctor asks you to sign a piece of paper, that paper protects you. You think the words informed consent means somebody, somewhere, told you everything. You think the trials run in clean buildings with nameplates and ethics committees were always clean. They were not. Every protection you trust right now was written after a body, after a coffin, after a mother who had to identify her own son on a steel table because some scientist forgot to mention page 17. 6 trials, 6 promises of progress. Every signature on the consent form was real. Every doctor knew more than they told. This is not a story about villains in cartoons. This is worse. This is a story about respected men, men with awards on their walls, men whose universities are still on your insurance card, men who shook hands with senators and prime ministers and walked out of every hearing without a single charge filed against them. They did not hide in basements. They published their results in famous journals. Some of them won prizes for what I am about to describe. I want you to remember one number tonight. Page 17. The risks page in Jesse Gelsinger's consent form was page 17. The word death appeared there once. Jesse signed page 1. He was 18 years old. He had a beard he was proud of. He had 2 younger brothers and a stepmother and a father who, 10 years later, would become the most dangerous man in America to anyone running a clinical trial. Because Paul Gelsinger learned to read every page, most of the people in these stories did not get to read every page. Most of them did not even get a page. Some of them were too young. Some of them were too poor. Some of them were locked inside an institution where the only way to get a bed for your child was to nod when the doctor asked. Some of them were told they had bad blood in a county in Alabama where bad blood meant nothing and meant everything, and where the cure existed in a refrigerator 3 counties away and was never given. I am going to walk you through 6 rooms. 6 locked rooms. The doors have been opened by court orders, by leaked memos, by whistleblowers who lost their careers, and by the cold, patient work of journalists who refused to look away. In each room, there is a body. In each room, there is a paragraph of law that did not exist before that body was found. You live inside those paragraphs. Your children live inside those paragraphs. The next person you love who gets sick will live or die based on rules written by ghosts. So sit down, turn the lights low, and if you have a weak stomach, this is not the night. We start in Macon County, Alabama, 1932. Charlie Pollard was 26 years old. He worked land that did not belong to him. He had 2 pairs of pants and 1 pair of shoes. He had a wife. He had children. He could not read the letter that came in the mail, but ancient it the way people mentioned the weather. Buxton did not believe it. He went to the library. He found the published papers. There were many. The study had been published in medical journals more than a dozen times across 40 years. Nobody had hidden it. Doctors had simply not cared. Buxton wrote letters. He wrote to the director of the Centers for Disease Control. He wrote in 1966. He wrote again in 1968. The CDC convened a panel to discuss whether to continue the study. The panel voted to continue. Buxton was told to stop writing. He was told he was being unprofessional. He was reassigned. He kept writing. In 1972, he gave the documents to a friend at the Associated Press. The friend gave them to a young reporter named Jean Heller. Heller spent 3 weeks confirming. Then she filed the story. It went on the wire on the morning of July 25, 1972. By that afternoon, every newspaper in the United States had it. By that evening, the Public Health Service was being asked to explain itself in a language nobody had ever asked them to use before. The language was English. The question was simple. Why? The answer was complicated. The answer involved committees and citations and 40 years of clinical reasoning. The answer was published in reports and addendums and dissenting opinions. None of those answers ever told Charlie Pollard why nobody had given him a single shot of penicillin in 25 years. Charlie Pollard sat down with reporters in 1972. He said one sentence that travels still. He said, "They kept saying I had bad blood. They never told me what kind." He said it without anger. He said it the way a man says he was misled by a friend. The cameras stayed on him. He had survived. The disease had been arrested in his system by accident. By some piece of luck or genetics or early treatment for something else. He had outlived his doctors. He outlived the study itself. He died many years later of unrelated causes, and at his funeral, his family said the words that the United States government would not say for another 25 years. They said, "He was not a research subject. He was a man." The official apology came in 1997. President Bill Clinton stood in the East Room of the White House and read the names of the 8 survivors who were still alive. They sat in chairs in front of him. The youngest was 87. The oldest was over 100. They had waited 65 years for a sentence. The sentence was, "What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf," they said, "on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry." 8 men, 8 chairs, 65 years, 1 sentence. That is what an apology costs when you wait too long to give it. The Tuskegee study did not end because the doctors changed their minds. It ended because a journalist named Gene Heller picked up a phone and a young man named Peter Buxton refused to stop writing letters that everyone above him told him to stop writing. Remember that. Every protection you trust now exists because somebody, somewhere, refused to be quiet when they were told to be quiet. After Tuskegee, Congress passed the National Research Act, 1974. The act created the Institutional Review Board. Every study on a human being, in every American university, in every hospital that takes federal money, must now pass through a committee that asks one question. Does the subject know what is happening to them? Charlie Pollard never had that committee. The committee exists because Charlie Pollard did not. Lesson 1. Trust without oversight is not trust. It is permission to harm. Now we move north. Staten Island, New York, 1956. There was a building called Willowbrook State School. The word school is the first lie in this story. Willowbrook was not a school. It was a warehouse for children with intellectual disabilities. It was built for 4,000 children. By 1965, it housed more than 6,000. The hallways smelled of urine and bleach. The dormitories had no doors on the bathrooms. Children sat on benches all day, rocking. Many of them had no clothes on. The staff ratio was 1 attendant for every 50 children. Some of those attendants worked 16-hour shifts. Most of those attendants had no medical training. Hepatitis spread through Willowbrook the way fire spreads through dry grass. Almost every child who arrived contracted hepatitis A within months. The disease was endemic. The disease was the building. The disease was the staff who could not wash their hands fast enough between bedpans because there were not enough sinks and not enough soap and not enough seconds in a day. Dr. Saul Krugman saw an opportunity. Krugman was a respected pediatrician. He worked at New York University. He had studied infectious disease for 20 years. He looked at Willowbrook and he did not see a public health emergency. He saw a laboratory. a natural laboratory, a place where every child would eventually contract hepatitis anyway, where the variable was already removed, where the disease was guaranteed. So he proposed a study. He would deliberately infect newly admitted children with hepatitis. He would observe them. He would try different vaccines on them. He would use the data to develop a treatment that eventually, somewhere, might help children outside Willowbrook. He needed permission. He went to the parents. Here is the part that matters. Willowbrook was full. There was a waiting list of years. Parents who could no longer care for their disabled children at home, who had no other options, who had been told by every other facility that there was no room, would arrive at Willowbrook desperate. And at the front door, in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, they were given a choice. The choice was this: your child can wait years for a regular admission, or your child can be admitted next week into a special research unit run by Dr. Krugman. The research unit has cleaner conditions. The research unit has better staff ratios. The research unit has more space. To get into the research unit, the parents had to sign a consent form. The form said the child would be exposed to hepatitis as part of a study. Most parents signed. They were told the child would get hepatitis at Willowbrook regardless. They were told the special unit was safer. They were told the research would help future children. The parents were not lied to in the way that Charlie Pollard was lied to. They were given a piece of paper with words on it. They were told what would happen. The form was technically informed, but the form was signed at a moment when the parent had no other option. There was no alternative facility. There was no home support. There was no respite care. The state of New York had built one institution for these children, and that institution was Willowbrook. And the only way to skip the waiting list was to volunteer your child for an experiment. This is not consent. This is what bioethicists later named coercion under desperation. A signature obtained from a parent who has no other door to open is not the signature of a free person. It is the signature of a trapped one. Krugman ran the study for 16 years. Hundreds of children were deliberately infected. He fed some of them milkshakes mixed with feces from infected patients. He injected others with serum drawn from sick children. He published his results in the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association. He gave talks at international conferences. He won the Lasker Award in 1983, which is the closest thing American medicine has to a Nobel Prize before the actual Nobel Prize. The man who deliberately infected hundreds of disabled children was given an award named after a woman, Mary Lasker, who spent her life raising money for medical research because she believed in medicine. The story broke in 1972. A young reporter named Geraldo Rivera, working for a local New York television station, smuggled a camera into Willowbrook. He recorded what he saw. He aired it on January 6, 1972. The footage showed naked children rocking on the floor, children with feces on their hands, children tied to benches, children screaming with no one to hear. The broadcast was 48 minutes long. By the end of it, the governor of New York had a press secretary calling reporters back, and the United States Senate had a committee opening files. Willowbrook closed in 1987. By then, every child who had passed through it as a research subject was an adult, and most of them could not testify, because most of them could not speak. The Krugman studies remained in the medical literature. They were not retracted. They are still cited today in textbooks on hepatitis vaccine development, with footnotes that acknowledge ethical concerns. Saul Krugman died in 1995 at the age of 84. He never returned the Lasker Award. The protection that came out of Willowbrook is the doctrine of voluntary consent. The federal regulations now state explicitly that consent given under coercion, including the implicit coercion of having no alternative, is not valid consent. A parent cannot trade access to care for participation in research. A prisoner cannot be offered better conditions in exchange for being a subject. A poor patient cannot be steered toward an experimental drug because the standard drug is too expensive for them. These rules exist on the page because of children whose names were never recorded outside of medical case files. Lesson 2. Consent given under desperation is not consent. It is coercion in a doctor's coat. We move again, north, across a border. Montreal, Canada, 1957. There is a hospital in Montreal called the Allen Memorial Institute. It is a beautiful building, a converted mansion on the side of a mountain with views of the city. In the 1950s, it was one of the most respected psychiatric hospitals in the world. The director was a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Donald Ewan Cameron. He had been the president of the American Psychiatric Association. He had testified at the Nuremberg trials. He was, by the standards of his time, an enlightened man. He was also, by 1957, on a CIA payroll. The program was called MK Ultra. It is a famous name now. In 1957, it was a secret. The CIA was funding research in dozens of universities and hospitals across North America into mind control. They wanted to know how to break a human personality and rebuild it. They wanted truth serums. They wanted Manchurian candidates. They wanted, in plain words, a way to take a person and make that person into a different person who would do what they were told. Cameron ran Subproject 68. He had a theory. He believed mental illness was caused by faulty thought patterns laid down over years, and that if you could erase those patterns, you could reprogram the patient with healthy thoughts. He called the erasure process depatterning. He called the rebuilding process psychic driving. Depatterning meant electroshock therapy at 6 times the standard dose, applied multiple times a day, for weeks. It meant induced sleep. Patients were kept unconscious with massive doses of barbiturates for up to 65 days at a time. It meant LSD. It meant insulin coma. It meant a combination of all of these, layered over months. Psychic driving meant audio loops, tape recorders playing the same phrase 10,000, 20,000, sometimes 500,000 times into the ears of unconscious patients. The phrases were chosen by Cameron. Phrases like, "You let your mother down." Phrases like, "You are a good person." Phrases like, "You are not afraid." The patients did not know any of this was happening to them. Mary Morrow was a doctor. She was a successful physician in Montreal in the 1950s. In 1957, she experienced what we would today call mild anxiety. She was tired. She had trouble sleeping. She went to the Allen Memorial Institute for help. She was a colleague. She trusted the place. She walked in on her own 2 feet. She walked in articulate, intelligent, employed. She had a husband and children. She had a career. She had memories. Cameron put her into the depatterning program. When she came out weeks later, she could not remember her children's names. She could not remember her medical training. She had to be retaught how to use a fork. She wet the bed. She had the cognitive function of a small child. The damage was permanent. She was one of dozens. There were patients who came in for postpartum depression who left unable to recognize their husbands. There were patients who came in for marital problems who left needing 24-hour care for the rest of their lives. None of them were told what was being done to them. None of them signed consent forms that mentioned electroshock at 6 times the standard dose. None of them signed consent forms that mentioned LSD. None of them knew the CIA was paying their doctor. The program ran from 1957 to 1964. It ended not because anyone stopped Cameron. It ended because Cameron retired. He moved to Albany, New York. He took a position at a hospital. He died of a heart attack in 1967 while hiking on a mountain in Lake Placid. He was 66 years old. He had never been charged with anything. He had never been investigated. The patients he destroyed were still alive, in nursing homes and in their parents' basements when he was buried with full professional honors. The story came out in pieces over 20 years. The Church Committee in 1975 began the unraveling. The CIA had destroyed most of the MK Ultra files in 1973 on the order of Director Richard Helms. But some files survived in financial records because a clerk had filed them in the wrong cabinet. From those financial records, investigators traced payments to Cameron. From there, the patients. The Canadian government in 1992 agreed to pay $100,000 to each surviving victim. $100,000 for a destroyed life. For a destroyed memory. For a destroyed family. The settlement required signing a non-disclosure agreement. Many patients refused. Many patients had died waiting. Many patients had never been told what happened to them and never would be. Mary Morrow lived into her 80s. She regained some function. She never regained her medical license. She fought for the rest of her life for her records to be released, for her name to be cleared, for the words of what was done to her to appear in writing in a place where her grandchildren could read them. Lesson 3. A signature on a government letterhead does not make a crime legal. The institution that pays for the harm is as guilty as the hand that delivers it. We move forward. We move toward the present. The next 3 names are not from a different century. They are from the lifetime of anyone watching this video over the age of 30. Philadelphia, September 13th, 1999. Jesse Gelsinger was 18 years old. He had a beard he was proud of. He rode a motorcycle. He wrestled in high school. He had a rare genetic disorder called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency. His liver did not properly process ammonia. He had been managing it since childhood with a strict diet and 32 pills a day. The version he had was mild. He was, in the words of his doctors, a stable patient. He was not dying. He was not even close to dying. He volunteered for a gene therapy trial at the University of Pennsylvania because the principal investigator, Dr. James Wilson, told him the therapy might one day help babies born with the severe form of the disease. Babies born with the severe form usually die in their first year. Jesse looked at those babies and thought, I have it easy. I should help. The trial was Phase 1. Phase 1 trials are not designed to help the patient. They are designed to test safety. The dose Jesse received was the highest dose of the trial. He was the 18th patient. He was injected with a modified adenovirus carrying a corrective gene. The injection went directly into his hepatic artery, which is the main blood supply to the liver. Within hours, his liver began to fail. Within 24 hours, his kidneys followed. Within 48 hours, his lungs were filling with fluid. Within 72 hours, his brain was swelling. He died on September 17, 1999, 4 days after the injection. His father, Paul Gelsinger, was at his bedside. Paul thought at first that this was a tragedy, a bad luck, a medical accident. The doctors said as much. Dr. Wilson sent flowers. There was a memorial service. The university expressed condolences. Then Paul started reading. He read the consent form Jesse had signed. The consent form was 11 pages long. Page 1 had Jesse's signature. Page 17, the risks page, mentioned death. The consent form did not mention that 2 prior patients in the same trial had experienced serious side effects, including liver toxicity. The consent form did not mention that monkeys in the preclinical trials had died from the same vector. The consent form did not mention that Dr. James Wilson had a financial stake in the company that owned the gene therapy patent, and that a successful trial would make him personally wealthy. The FDA inspection that followed found that the trial had violated more than a dozen federal regulations. Jesse should not have been enrolled at all. His ammonia levels on the day of the injection were elevated. The protocol said any elevation excluded the patient. Jesse was injected anyway. The investigators on the trial later said they thought the elevation was minor, a judgment call. A man's son was dead because of a judgment call. The FDA suspended all gene therapy trials in the United States. Wilson lost his clinical privileges. He never lost his job. He still teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. He still publishes. The institution paid the Gelsinger family a settlement. The amount was not disclosed. Paul Gelsinger gave most of it away. Paul Gelsinger became something the medical establishment had never seen before: a bereaved parent who learned to read consent forms, a father who could quote the code of federal regulations, a man who showed up at every conference, at every hearing, at every public meeting, and who asked the questions that nobody wanted asked. He still does this. He is, 25 years later, the reason American gene therapy trials operate under rules far stricter than the rest of the world. Page 17. Remember that number. The risks page. The page that did not mention what mattered. Lesson 4. A consent form that hides risks is a contract written for the doctor, not the patient. Baltimore, May 4th, 2001. Ellen Roche was 24 years old. She worked as a research technician at the Johns Hopkins Asthma and Allergy Center. She loved her job. She loved the building. She volunteered for a study on healthy lungs because she wanted to help her own colleagues understand the disease they were treating. The study involved inhaling a chemical called hexamethonium. The doctor running the study, Dr. Alkis Togias, had read about hexamethonium in older medical literature. The chemical had once been used as a blood pressure medication in the 1950s. It had been withdrawn from the market in 1972 because it caused too many side effects. Dr. Togias did a literature search. He used PubMed. PubMed is the standard medical database. It indexes papers going back to 1966. The papers warning about hexamethonium's lung toxicity were published in the 1950s. They were not in PubMed. Dr. Togias did not search older databases. He did not use Google. He did not call a pharmacologist. He filed his protocol with the Hopkins IRB. The IRB approved it. Ellen Roche inhaled the chemical on May 4th. Within a day, she had a cough. Within 3 days, she could not breathe. The hexamethonium had triggered an obliterative reaction in her bronchial tubes. Her airways were turning into scar tissue. The scarring spread into her alveoli. Her lungs were hardening from the inside. She spent the next month in intensive care. Doctors tried steroids. They tried mechanical ventilation. They tried experimental treatments. None of it worked. She died on June 2nd, 2001. Multi-organ failure secondary to lung damage. She was 24. The Federal Office for Human Research Protections, OHRP, suspended every single human research study at Johns Hopkins. 2,400 studies. Stopped. The shutdown lasted 3 weeks. It was the largest research suspension in American history. Hopkins lost millions of dollars in federal funding. Dr. Togias kept his position. He still works at Hopkins. The investigation found something almost unbearable. A graduate student, in the year before Ellen Roche's death, had searched for hexamethonium and lung damage. The student had found the 1950s papers. The student had mentioned the warnings to a senior researcher in passing. The conversation was casual. The student went on with their work. Nobody followed up. Nobody told Dr. Togias. The paper trail ended in a corridor between two people, in a sentence that was forgotten before it crossed the threshold of a door. A Google search. That is what would have saved Ellen Roche's life. In 2001, Google had been operating for 3 years. The papers warning about hexamethonium were available online to anyone who looked. Nobody at Hopkins, on a study designed to inhale that chemical into the lungs of a healthy young woman, ran the search. Nobody picked up a phone. Nobody asked the basic question that any first-year medical student is taught to ask. Has this been done before? And what happened? After Ellen Roche died, the federal regulations were rewritten. Every IRB protocol must now include a comprehensive literature review. The literature review must include older databases. The investigator must document in writing that they have searched not only the recent literature, but the historical record. There is now a checklist. Item 1 on the checklist is, has this drug or chemical been used in humans before? And what happened? The checklist exists because Ellen Roche died of a question nobody asked. Lesson 5. Modern medicine fails when modern tools are ignored. The most expensive death in research is the one that was already prevented in a paper from 1953. Wearific receptor on immune cells. 6 healthy young men were paid £2,000 to participate. They were aged 18 to 34. They had been screened. They were in good health. They were given a starting dose. The starting dose is a small fraction of the dose that had been safe in animal trials. Standard practice. A first in-human dose is supposed to be cautious. The starting dose for TGN 1412 was calculated as 500 times lower than the dose that had been safe in monkeys. That sounds careful. It is the kind of margin that sounds careful when you read it in a regulatory document. It is the kind of margin that does not sound careful when you understand what TGN 1412 does. TGN 1412 was a class of drug that had never been given to a human before. It was designed to activate the immune system. The activation cascade was novel. The mathematics that translates animal doses to human doses, called allometric scaling, assumes the drug works the same way in humans as in animals. TGN 1412 did not. The injections were given at 8-minute intervals. By the time the 6th man received his dose, the first man was already in trouble. By 90 minutes after the first injection, all 6 men were in the worst pain of their lives. They tore at their clothes. They begged the doctors to kill them. Their heads swelled. Their lungs filled with fluid, their hearts raced, their kidneys stopped, their skin turned the color of bruise. What happened to them is now called a cytokine storm. The immune system, instead of being gently stimulated, had gone into total war. Every part of every man's body was screaming chemical alarms at every other part. The reaction was so severe that one of the men, a young Australian named Ryan Wilson, lost his fingertips and his toes. They turned black from oxygen starvation and had to be amputated. None of them died. They were saved by the speed of the response. Northwick Park is a hospital. The intensive care unit was on the same campus. Within an hour, all 6 men were in ICU, on dialysis, on ventilators, on dozens of drugs. They survived because the trial happened to be located 80 meters from one of the most aggressive critical care units in the British National Health Service. If the trial had been run anywhere else, in a standalone facility, in a clinic without a hospital, in a country with weaker emergency medicine, all 6 men would have died within 4 hours. The investigation that followed produced what is called the Duff Report, named after the chairman of the inquiry. The report concluded that the starting dose had been calculated using a method that did not account for the unique mechanism of the drug. The report recommended that all first-in-human trials of immunostimulant drugs use a different calculation, called Minimum Anticipated Biological Effect Level, or MABEL. The MABEL approach starts from the dose at which the drug has any effect at all in a human, and then divides by a much larger margin of safety. It is more conservative. It is slower. It costs more money. It is now the global standard for any drug that works through the immune system. Tegenero, the German biotech that owned the drug, declared bankruptcy 4 months after the trial. The drug was never developed further. Ryan Wilson, the Australian, sued. He received a settlement. He lives today with prosthetic fingers, with reconstructed feet, with a body that aches every morning when he wakes up. He is in his 40s now. He volunteered when he was 20-something for £2,000 and the chance to help people with leukemia. He gave more than he intended to give. The leukemia patients got the lesson he paid for. He got the bill. Lesson 6. A first dose in humans is never just a number. It is a leap into the dark. The size of that leap is the only thing standing between the volunteer and the grave. That is 6. Charlie Pollard, the children of Willowbrook, Mary Morrow, Jesse Gelsinger, Ellen Roche. Ryan Wilson and the 5 men beside him at Northwick Park. 6 trials, 6 bodies, or, in the case of Ryan, 6 bodies that came back from the place where bodies do not come back from. 6 new paragraphs in the Code of Federal Regulations. 6 new chapters in the bioethics textbooks. 6 names that nobody in the medical schools wants to teach in the order I have just taught them, because in that order, the pattern becomes too clear. The pattern is this. Every protection you trust right now was written after somebody trusted a doctor and the doctor was wrong, or the doctor was lying, or the doctor was being paid by a government agency that had no intention of telling the patient who was paying. The Institutional Review Board exists because of Tuskegee. The voluntary consent doctrine exists because of Willowbrook. The prohibition on government-funded covert research on civilians exists because of MK Ultra. The federal financial disclosure rules for principal investigators exist because of Jesse Gelsinger. The mandatory literature review requirements exist because of Roche. The Mabel dosing standard for immunostimulant drugs exists because of Ryan Wilson and the 5 men beside him. Every paragraph, every rule, every signature line on every consent form you will ever be asked to sign. Paid for, in advance, by people who did not know they were paying. I want to tell you something now that the medical schools do not put in the opening chapters of the textbook. They put it in the back, in the appendix, under the heading Historical Context. They teach it in the last week of the bioethics elective, if they teach it at all. The history of medicine is not the history of discovery. It is the history of discovery on top of somebody. It is the history of what a doctor did to a person who trusted him and what the law said after the funeral. The white coat is a garment that was stitched, thread by thread, out of the silence of the dead. Every time you put one on, you are wearing the weight of Charlie Pollard's wife, of the children in Willowbrook, of Mary Morrow's children's names that she could not remember, of Jesse's beard, of Ellen's cough, of Ryan's fingers. You are not wearing a coat. You are wearing a debt. I said at the beginning of this video that there is a folder on a desk in Bethesda, Maryland. That folder is real. It is at the Office for Human Research Protections. It is the file that new OHRP investigators read on their first day of work. 6 case summaries, 6 photographs, 6 questions at the bottom of each summary in the same handwriting. How did this happen? Why did nobody stop it? What is the rule that must exist now so that this does not happen again? And the 4th question, the one that the handwriting underlines twice. Who will remember this when I am gone? That is the job. That is the whole job. Remembering. If you are a patient watching this video, remember that your signature is the most powerful word you will ever speak. Read the page. Ask for the page that is not there. Ask the question, has this been done before, and what happened? Ask the question, who pays you? Ask the question, what is on page 17? If you are a doctor watching this video, remember that the coat you wear has names stitched into the lining. Learn them. Say them out loud to yourself on the days you are tired, and the days you are angry, and the days you are bored. Charlie, Mary, Jesse, Ellen, Ryan, and the children of Willowbrook, whose names were never written down, but who are the reason you are allowed to touch another human being at all. If you are neither, if you are just somebody who clicked on this video because the thumbnail looked strange and the title looked it, 6 trials, 6 bodies, 6 paragraphs of law. Every protection you trust was written in someone else's blood. Every signature on the consent form was real. Every doctor knew more than they told. Next time, we go into the 7th room. There is a 7th room. There is always a 7th room. It is not closed yet. The door is open, the experiment is still running, and the volunteers do not know they have volunteered. I will show you who they are, what is being done to them, and why the folder for this one has not yet been placed on the desk in Bethesda. I am Blackwell.